Welcome to the Poetry Room, everybody. I'm Peter Maravellis, your host, and welcome to City Lights. And for those of you online, welcome to you as well. As always, we are... Hi, James. It's going great. As always, we are beaming to you from the unceded ancestral homeland of the Ramaytush people. It is always an honor and a privilege to be able to do so. And it's always fantastic to have Pat Thomas here with us again in the house, this time celebrating a new book, Evergreen Review, Dispatches from the Literary Underground, Covers and Essays, 1957 through 1973. It is published by our friends over at Fantagraphics, and it is an absolutely stunning book, and it is hot off the presses. They just arrived today. They had the custom seals on them. That's how exciting it was. It was like Christmas, like opening up this package that was just inside of a package, inside of a package. So we have had the great pleasure of hosting Pat in the past for his Penn Award-winning book, Material Wealth, The Personal Archives of Allen Ginsberg, which we do have, by the way, on sale here tonight. And in this new book, Pat has compiled full color reproductions of all of the front covers of the Evergreen Review, plus hundreds of pages from many of the issues, including illustrations, photography, advertisements, albums, letters to the editor, much, much more. Pat also interviewed a whole bunch of people from the original 60s era staffers of Evergreen, really making this one of the most extensive publications exploring this really seminal cultural powerhouse. And which has a great deal of meaning to us here at City Lights because many of our friends and many of our colleagues were featured in the Evergreen Review. So there's this very strong connection to City Lights. So, and again, just beautifully, beautifully produced. So, you know, kudos to Pat. He is, of course, an author, historian, and editor. His previous book includes Listen Whitey, The Sights and Sounds of Black Power. Also the book Did It, Jerry Rubin, An American Revolutionary. He was also a co-editor of Invitation to Openness, The Jazz and Soul Photography of Les McCann. So in cooperation with the estate of Allen Ginsberg, of course, as I mentioned, Material Wealth, which was the Penn Award winner. He's also co-editor of Ernie and Kovacs Land, Drawings and Photographs. So he's going to be joined tonight by none other than Steve Wasserman, who, of course, is the publisher of Heyday Books. He is no stranger to City Lights, a longtime venerable bookman by all measures of the stick. He has served as publisher, editor, editorial director at such places as Farrar, Straus & Giroux, Noonday Press, Times Books, as well as serving as literary agent to some pretty legendary authors. So his recent book, which we also have on display here tonight, Tell Me Something, Tell Me Anything, Even If It's a Lie. What a title. A memoir and essay. So great honor to have you both with us. We're going to have a little Q&A at the end. So for those of you online, post your questions in the chat function of your Zoom dashboard. If you're interested in buying the book, I'm putting information there as well. And Pat, of course, will be signing books tonight. So, gentlemen, welcome to City Lights.
Thank you.
This is great. I see a lot of familiar faces, people I mainly know through the music business. God help us. But we're still going. It's great to have Steve with me. Some of my previous book events, Steve was right in the front row cheering me on, Ginsberg and Jerry Rubin.
Moving up in the world.
Yes. If you sit in the front row for 2 events in a row, I ask you to co-host the 3rd event. So the Evergreen Review, you may be wondering, some of you might wonder what the hell that's all about. So in the late 1950s, a guy named Barney Rosset acquired a small press called Grove Press. And this became the home of Henry Miller, Kerouac, the autobiography of Malcolm X, a lot of subversive literature. And this was back in a day when little paperbacks sold a lot of copies. And Barney, Richard Seaver, Fred Jordan, these guys realized that there was a market for a magazine. And their first issues of the magazine, this is 2 front covers, were actually printed as paperback books. And they were distributed by book publishers, originally more than magazine publishers, with the idea that they would stay in print sometimes for several years. This second issue, the San Francisco Scene, was the first time that the general public across the country had heard of Ferlinghetti, Kerouac before On the Road, an excerpt of Howl, Michael McClure, and so on. And it kind of grew from there. And these are the back covers. I'm kind of going a little quickly here. But by the early 60s, they realized that something what they called a Playboy magazine size would actually do even better. And so we started to get into, this is the first full-size issue. This is June 65. And they really got into these bright, expressive covers. Sometimes they get a little more provocative. And as time went on, you had Black Panthers contributing, you had Abby Hoffman and Jerry Rubin, you had Germaine Greer, you had Norman Mailer, just about everybody you can think of, kind of blending politics, counterculture. Vietnam War was a big thing. My book includes some prison poems from Ho Chi Minh, because I know you guys have been waiting for those to be reprinted since they were first printed. As the 60s went on, we got into Peter Max type covers. So how I got the idea for this book is my first book was about the Black Panthers. My second book explored Jerry Rubin, Abby Hoffman, and the Yippies. My third book was Ginsberg. And so this sort of tied together all these elements of things that I love. Individual copies of the Evergreen Review, if you find them on eBay, can average anywhere from 25 to 75 bucks a piece. And one day I see the entire 120 copy print run in mint condition from some guy in Texas for $2,000. And it was like, wow. They come, they're totally in great shape. I spend a few months researching who would have to give me permission, and the whole thing kind of blew out from there. So that's sort of the origins of the magazine and how I came to do it. The other thing I want to tell you is that almost every large hardcover book in here that's big and visual is usually printed in China. Chinese do great full color printing, very low costs, and almost every American publisher you can think of, if they're doing a coffee table book, is probably doing China. Even though these books are never sold in China, the Chinese government likes to spot check what's being printed. And so in January, Chinese government stopped by Fantagraphics' usual printer, and when they saw Black Panthers and Yippies and Vietnam and mentions of Chairman Mao, they shut down the press. So we had to start all over. We had to move the artifacts over to India. Now, there was a benefit from that, which is Trump hasn't decided to do tariffs with India yet. He'll probably do that tomorrow after he watches this Zoom. However, that set us back by 2 or 3 months. I had already booked this tour. So, at great expense to me, I've air freighted a couple hundred books to America for this tour. For the next 2 months, the only place to buy this book are at the stores where I'm appearing. Amazon, Barnes & Noble, other bookstores around the country will not have this book until July. And then the last part of my sales pitch is, you see how big this book is. Take this book and its heft and walk around the store, and you'll probably see every other book similar to it is at least 50 to 75 bucks. This book is $34.99 because I'm foregoing my royalties so that the book itself is priced to move. And that's my rant. Thank you very much. I'll let Steve talk for a minute.
So that concludes the evening. And, the sacrificial lamb for literature itself.
Steve wants to sign me, and then I'll just pay for every book that I do with him.
This is an odd position to be in because we are at ground zero for the Evergreen Review.
Yes, we are.
I mean, we're in front of an audience which probably actually we should be the two of us sitting in this audience, and any number of you could speak more authoritatively and by experience than perhaps either of us can, although I'm going to try to do my best. I mean, walking into this, to these hallowed precincts on the occasion of the publication of your book is, in a way, for me, revisiting my adolescence. I mean, my folks moved to the Bay Area in 1963. And I would not have had the adolescence I had were it not for Barney, Rosset, Grove Press, Evergreen Review, among others. I mean, they introduced me to, I toppled into a world of anarchic, erotic, freewheeling, mind-bending agitation. And when they got done with me, I was turned inside out and could look at the world with new eyes. Your book places a kind of premium on a lot of the politics that wafted through the pages of Evergreen Review. Some years ago, probably, I think in the early 80s, Grove Press published a precursor to this book, a big 800-page compendium called the Evergreen Review Reader, edited by Barney Ross, which included, decade by decade, the first 10 years of the Evergreen Review's life. Founded in 1957, it took it through 1967, which arguably were the glory years. There
Right.
was some afterglow for some years afterward, but those 10 years were indelible, and they really helped to change the culture, along with a number of other magazines. So they published this big compendium. The great thing about the compendium is they included all the words of the many, the whole spectrum of remarkable people, from Jean Genet to Albert Camus' original piece about calling for the end to the death penalty in France, his famous essay, which was in the first issue of 1957, to the Romanian-French philosopher Emile Cioran, to many other people that you would have heard of and that you were cited. They put in all the words, that was great, but they weirdly left out all the illustrations, all the artwork. And you can't really imagine what a striking thing was the integration of the words that were often incendiary and unusual and mind-expanding, and the liveliness of the illustrative matter. They had genius art directors who I think even at the time knew that they were building a kind of golden age, which they would forever remember. Now, golden ages, of course, always lie in the past and are usually synonymous with one's youth.
Yes.
And for good reason,
Yeah.
because death looks like it's far away and it's not coming very fast for you. If you get a little older, then the shadow line of one's mortality advances with an alarming rapidity. In this case, the founding geniuses and mischief makers who put this together were almost all of them, without exception, refugees from the Second World War,
Yeah.
or had come of age, and they went to Columbia and other ne'er-do-well places, and they met each other in poetry courses like Ginsberg and Kerouac and the others, and then they went west. And they were very quickly conscious of themselves, I would say, as a group, as
Yeah.
a generational cohort. And Ginsberg, among others, they began documenting themselves. I mean, it was, in a way, there were previous generations that also in the 20s, Scott Fitzgerald and others, that constituted themselves as a generation. But the popularity of Brownie cameras made it possible to photograph everything all the time, 24/7. So we have a long record of their self-documentation, which is somewhat on offer in the ways in which they explore their sensibilities and their temperaments. One striking thing that you sort of, I wouldn't say you omit it, but you don't give it center stage, and it occupied a greater proportion of the earlier work that Rosset himself did,
Yeah.
was on the literary aspects.
That's true.
And maybe your zealousness in sort of understanding that had a prior iteration made you want to err on the side of some of the more political elements. But talk to us a little bit about what went into the decision to stack the deck, as it were, in favor of the politics and slight the deck a bit, at least as a cursory run-through of the otherwise incendiary contents of this very valuable volume.
So as Steve has pointed out, there's actually 2 volumes that Barney Rosset himself did, and that is packed with the literature. Genet, Beckett, Samuel Beckett, Kerouac, Mailer. So I didn't want to do anything that had already been done. And then the other thing is, if you look at my previous 3 books, Yippies, Panthers, Ginsey, right? I wanted the social political stuff. So in here are articles praising Hanoi Jane. In here is John Kerry coming back from the Vietnam War in 1972 and saying, this sucks ass. There's interviews with Eldridge Cleaver, Amiri Baraka. The other thing, connecting what just happened to me in China, there is the complete transcript of the Naked Lunch trial in Boston, where they interview Norman Mailer and Ginsberg, who testified. So it's really, to quote Sinatra, I did it my way. Now, the other thing, when you flip through this book, is I mentioned how expensive it would be to buy all these issues. So this is the only Evergreen anthology that Steve pointed out. I'm doing facsimile pages. So when you're reading these various articles, you're seeing, as he said, the illustrations, but you're also going, oh, there's an ad for Van Morrison's Moon Dance. Oh, there's an ad for Ginsberg's reading of Howl. There's ads like this one. Remember the ecology flag? Remember that? Some of you, you're old enough, I know, to remember the ecology flag. So you really feel like you're reading a stack of evergreens, and rather than pay the $2,000 that I paid for $34.99, call before midnight tonight. PBS operators are standing by.
So it isn't lost on me that at the very moment that the nostalgia for this publication is most robust, coincides with the exact moment in our culture in which magazines are basically finished. I mean, in other words, this is a tombstone
It is.
to an era which should be put either in the Beat Museum or in a museum devoted to kitsch. Because the truth of the matter is that however radioactive these old bones are still,
Right.
the truth of the matter is that the culture has moved on. And we look at this thing with those of us who lived with it, and with some degree of sentiment, partly because we're still in one of the stages of denial or grief for its disappearance. This was not the only such publication, of course, that had a tremendous burst of excitement.
Ramparts.
There was Ramparts magazine, edited by Robert Shear and the late Warren Hinkle, a figure of some repute in this town, and the art director Dougal Sturmer was widely
And you
admired.
published a Hinkle.
I did.
Yes.
I did. It sold 750 copies. Thank you very much. Which is the verdict the market renders on those who would assert themselves in such a way. But in any event, it was not only them. I mean, not only Evergreen Review. Esquire magazine in this period under Harold Hayes has a fair claim to have it make a dramatic and contribution to a culture that was inventing itself. But the question I want to ask you is, for all the affection that you have for the old slogans and the old interviews by such people as Eldridge Cleaver and the others, and I knew him, don't you think that really the slogans fade away, but literature is forever? And a single play of Ionesco's probably has more life in it than the old slogans, or most of them. Or have I got that wrong?
Well, you know, I'm a little bit of the radical chic guy, right? So
Yeah, but increasingly playing maybe to a party on Park Avenue to which very few people come.
well, as you mentioned, Hinkle book, you know, selling 750 copies. I sometimes wake up and go, why the hell am I doing this? Because I could be binging on Netflix, I call Domino's, I get some pizzas, you know, a Diet Coke, maybe, you know. So I question my own sanity sometimes. What happened to me, I'm born in 1964, so obviously I did not really live through this era. But when I was 10, my brother walked in, he was 9 years old, with a copy of Steal This Book. Now, I did not understand the political aspects, but the idea of making phone calls for free, taking a pizza box, bringing it into a record store, sticking the albums into the pizza box, stealing the albums, blowing shit up, right? This seemed like fun and excitement. And this led to me, by the time I was 16, I was reading Howl. I read Kerouac. My dad, who thankfully went from conservative Republican to liberal Democrat over a 92-year run, at that point he was still more of a Reaganite, and he said, these books are fucking up your head. And then I moved to the Bay Area, right? You grow up in Rochester and Buffalo, New York, and San Francisco feels like Mecca. And one of the first places I went was right here, right? And then I moved to Oakland at some point because you couldn't afford to live in San Francisco anymore. And I met David Hilliard, and I met Elaine Brown, and I met Erica Huggins. And I just and I had met Ginsberg much earlier. And so I just am sort of enamored with this, and I feel like it's my goal to keep the counterculture alive until I fucking croak. So that's what I'm doing.
You know, when you leaf through these pages, what comes across to me, if I had to walk away and say, what is the story that all these chapters tell, united together? Like, what is the takeaway? What's the moral? For me, I go through these pages, and it was true at the time, because I was a subscriber eventually to Evergreen Review. They tell me a story about people who have decided to try to be serious while having fun.
Yes.
There's a lust for life that is in every page, and often in almost every sentence. And you feel like people, there are two things at work. People both want to write history and they want to make history. They want to be ardent. They want to be alive to their times. They also want to see the big picture. So they're constantly asking, big existential questions, like the kind that one asks in a sleeping bag in the middle of the night, camped out at Yosemite. Particularly if you're 12 years old with a bent for philosophy, you look up at the stars and you say,
I love it.
what does it all mean, and where am I in all of this? And those questions are never trivialized by these people. So I grew up reading them, and I wanted to curl myself up into these pages and pull them over me like they were a blanket. I wanted to, and then I have to say that through the great goddess serendipity, I would come later to know many of these people and even to befriend them. Some of them I even was privileged to call comrades. I'll never forget being in New York, being considered for a position to be editor of a small imprint then with Holt, Reinhardt, and Winston. Whose publisher was one Richard Seaver.
Who's a key figure in this whole Evergreen story.
So we're going to go back to, we'll learn more. Now, I was always a close reader of the acknowledgments and even of the mastheads of magazines for wholly unaccountable reasons. And I would study these mastheads, and I would remember these names of people, and they were like the gods and goddesses on Mount Olympus. I almost thought they didn't really exist. Who were they? With strange names like Dugald Sturmer and Richard Seaver. And so I'm ushered into Seaver's office. The year is 1983.
Wow.
Okay.
Yeah.
In New York City. I'm then living in Los Angeles, being mistaken from being from a New Yorker, so having decided to embrace my fate and actually move there, I was trying to get a job. And I walk into him, and I knew that Dick Seaver was the publisher and editor of John Berger's Great Ways of Seeing, which you have on the shelves here. And he had published this guy, Cioran, who nobody else had ever read.
Right.
And so, and along with many other people, he had translated the story of O. He was associated with Grove Press. He was one of the principal editors of Evergreen Review. I'm ushered into his office, and I meet this guy. He's one of those people who inhabits his skin with an enviable ease. He seemed entirely comfortable in his own body, something I always rather envy if people can manage to bring that off. And he says, so we get into this conversation. He says, well, who do you admire? Who do you like? And I look at him and I said, I love the work of Émile Cioran. He looks at me, he says, what? You've heard of this person? Of all the people I've published. Berger to the side. I have most admired this person who nobody other than me has ever read. And so we're like off to the races with this guy.
Good for you.
So how do you account for, and tell us a little bit about how all these people, these very strong characters, beginning with Barney Rosset,
Yeah.
and Dick Seaver, and the other, Fred Jordan, who's a Viennese refugee.
That's right.
Who edits Malcolm X, the autobiography of Malcolm X. How did these people find themselves, and how did they work together? And what was the alchemy that produced this great magazine?
I'm going to sort of skim read a few things. Barney is a legendary. Barney was in many ways probably more like, Keith Moon than Lawrence Ferlinghetti. Barney knew how to party. Barney was a day drinker. And it's my conclusion, without having met Barney, but having talked to many of his staff, that Barney was an ideas man, and it was guys like Richard Seaver and Fred Jordan and others who did the heavy lifting.
You shouldn't neglect that Barney, unlike the others, also came with a bank account.
Well, yes.
He was the scion of a very prosperous Chicago banking family, and he was the black sheep of the family, like so many publishers that began from wealthy families, like New Directions, that descend from a steel fortune. Thank you very much, James Laughlin, and others who were the black sheep of their family, and for reasons best known to themselves, decided to hurl themselves over the precipice of literature, decided they wanted to collect authors, and they were also, in addition to being blessed with a bit of money, they also, many of them, were cursed with good taste. Barney had good taste.
Yeah, and Barney, I found out, did a civil rights film around 1947 when nobody cared, right? In other words, long before MLK, whatever, it died a horrible death. So Barney was really a First Amendment guy. And I have this quote that I love from John Waters. We're still benefiting from the freedoms of what we have, of what Barney, Rosset, Evergreen, and Grove did because of the battles they fought. They didn't have a press agent, but they had a censorship courtroom battles, which is the same thing. Barney said, I personally feel that not a word has ever been written or uttered that shouldn't be published. For me, the idea of publishing and anti-censorship go naturally together. He loved a good courtroom fight. I mean, Naked Lunch got into big battles, and Henry Miller. And also, Barney didn't necessarily love everything that he published, but he loved for the right for it to exist. And the other thing is, yes, San Francisco is in many ways ground zero, but let's talk about New York City for a bit, right? All of the Evergreen offices, I found out, were within a 4-block radius at all times, close to the San Remo Cafe, the Stonewall Inn, site of the gay protests, Bill Graham's Fillmore East, the legendary Strand Bookstore, Jazz Hub Village Vanguard, the Bitter End Cafe Woe, and the office of Village Voice. And Barney spent his time cruising through here. He also spent a lot of time with Jackson Pollock, Franz Klein, and de Kooning at the Cedar Tavern. This was also the hangout for Corso, Ginsberg, whatever. One of my favorite, most colorful mythology about the Cedar Tavern is Jackson Pollock getting banned for ripping the bathroom door from its hinges and tossing it across the room at Franz Klein. Kerouac was gentler. He merely pissed into the ashtray. The other thing is that I'm a big music freak. As I mentioned, many of the people here in this audience know me through that. So a guy named Harold Feinstein, who designed several of the early iconic Blue Note album covers, mostly with Francis with photos, did the first handfuls of the Evergreen Review. So there's that. Also in this anthology I did, I found great articles about Sun Ra. Paul Williams, who was a good friend of mine, founder of Crawdaddy, which starts before Rolling Stone, talks about his love of The Who and the Beach Boys. There's great articles in here about free jazz. Evergreen wasn't as music-oriented as you may think, but there was a fair amount of that. And then, as we all know, when counterculture and pop culture blended, you've got all these ads for all these rock and roll albums that are inside the Evergreen Review, even if Evergreen isn't actually writing about them. So I sprinkled through here ads for Paul Butterfield Blues Band and Judy Collins and all kinds of groovy stuff.
That was largely a result, I think, of a generational shift.
Yes.
The people who established Evergreen Review, as I say, really came out of the Second World War.
Right.
The people who would go on to found Rolling Stone or Crawdaddy came out of the baby boom generation.
Right.
They were born either a couple of years before the war ended or just right around the war. And Greil Marcus, for instance, was born in 1946, just as the war was ending. So they came of age when the free speech movement broke out, and then suddenly there was a San Francisco Sound, and they were all gripped by that. Elder statesmen, like the late Ralph Gleason, who was hip enough to have started when he was in Columbia in the 30s, the first general magazine devoted to reviewing jazz, turned to Jan Wenner and said, there's something happening here, and you're the one to do that. Not me. I'm too old. You do that. What's interesting is that this magazine, among the others, because there was a whole archipelago, as you sort of nod to, with respect not only to music clubs, but also to the burgeoning artistic movements that were beginning to Royal Society, performances, Dadaistic things. Surrealism still had a kind of afterglow. You had Susan Sontag writing in the pages of Partisan Review her famous essay Against Interpretation, which said sometimes a rose is just a rose, and stop with the interpretation. Just why don't you get into it and then let the experience carry the day.
Right.
Which she grandly called we need both a hermeneutics, instead of a hermeneutics of art, we need an erotics of art. Well, we took the point, the whole generation took the point, but what this magazine, it seems to me, drives a wooden stake through the heart of the caricature that the 50s were a somnolent 50s, it was a dull 50s, it was a dead 50s, nothing was really happening, and it needed to be awakened by this thing called the 60s, which was going to be a tsunami, which was like a breath of fresh air, and blow all this bad, boring Eisenhower shit to away.
Right.
But what is on offer here is the intimations of quite a cultural revolution, which is starting to roil the suburban waters. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, totally. In fact, I'm sure many of you have heard of the Fugs. Well, there's Ed Sanders and there's Thule Kupfelberg. Thule said that nobody who lived through the 50s could ever imagine that the 60s were coming. So he says, keep that in mind, there's always hope. And in today's 2025 climate, I keep wondering, hoping, but I think we're a good 20 years before we have the next liberal, progressive, whatever it is that's coming, because right now we're trapped into a hell. Which brings me to another story that I haven't had a chance to tell yet. One of the most, probably the most famous, most iconic Evergreen cover, because you saw it at the time in dorm rooms, you still see it today on T-shirts and posters, is the legendary Che Guevara. This image became iconic. We've all seen this. Some of you may have your own version of it. So, no surprise, J. Edgar Hoover, whoever was running the CIA at the time, the Johnson administration, the Nixon, they were not big fans of Che Guevara's diaries. There's also articles about the original Tanya before Patty Hearst paid homage. Some of those are in my anthology. And so, supported by the CIA, some anti-Castro, pro-traditional Cuban guys got a rocket launcher. And at about 3 a.m., when the Evergreen Grove Press offices were vacant, they were able to throw a rocket up to the 8th floor, and a good chunk of the Grove Press offices around 1968 burned. Now, a lot of this has never been proven, but if you can access the COINTELPRO files, you definitely know what COINTELPRO is, and I certainly do, right? COINTELPRO was the FBI's program to sort of destroy the left, yippies, Panthers, And sometimes that included great handwriting fakes. So, for example, Eldridge Cleaver was living in Algiers, Huey was in Oakland. They would copy Huey's handwriting, send a snail mail to Eldridge, say, Eldridge, I think you're a punk-ass bitch. Your friend Huey, right? They could stir the shit. They also went into crazy shit. They started a rumor, which was probably true, that Jerry Rubin had BO. He probably did in 1970. But anyway, sometimes they got a little nastier, and this rocket launcher thing was not funny. And so, that, again, we're currently on the way over here. I was listening to some classic rock radio station, and all of a sudden a little voice said, the following ad is not necessarily the views of the DJ or the management. And I thought, well, what's this going to be? And it was actually an ad. I hadn't heard it before. President Trump invites you to leave the country if you're here illegally, and he'll strongly consider letting you back in legally if you leave now. I mean, I thought I was in a science fiction movie or a Goebbels speech. So, this book in my mind is very, very timely. It's you've been around a little longer than I have, and you've seen this come around.
That's only means that I've allowed myself to become more pickled in my prejudices. So hopefully the fermentation will be to others' liking. But I wanted to ask you a question. I mean, the book is a paean, as you observed a little earlier, to Barney Rosset and his colleagues' thoroughgoing commitment to, let's call it, Voltaireism. And that is to the notion of free speech. To if you don't like it, their motto was sticks and stones will break my bones, words will never hurt me. You don't like it, grow a thicker skin, but let's have it out. Let's have a contest of ideas. Let's let it all hang out. Do you think with such an attitude, if they were alive today, that such a magazine with that kind of ethos could happen again?
No. And the other thing that Barney was willing to do, and I believe I reproduced in there, Barney, Julius Lester, who was a well-known black activist and social critic, he wrote an article saying Evergreen Review sucks for all these reasons, and Barney gladly printed it, right? Can you imagine any magazine that you can think of, a major publication, having an op-ed piece telling you that this magazine is terrible, it's politically incorrect, it's this, it's that. But you mentioned something earlier I wanted to address, which is that the golden age of magazines is fading. Our attention spans are, we now scroll, right? We read little sound bites. Many of us, and I'm certainly guilty, spend way too much on the internet and a lot less time actually reading. So it's things have just changed radically. And the fact that a bookstore like this is still going. One of the things I love to say at these events, a lot of people will pop into a Starbucks and they'll spend $6 on a latte that lasts them about 12 minutes. Then they'll come into City Lights, they'll go, Jesus Christ, this book is $20? Are you friggin' kidding me? Well, that book is going to be in your collection for life. So why don't you skip 2 Starbucks and buy a paperback tonight? Think about it, folks.
Although, despite the doom and gloom that is everywhere to be had, the evidence in recent years doesn't really bear out our worst fears. About 25 years ago, we were at the nadir, and Peter will correct me if I'm wrong, but we were at the nadir of the number of bookstores in the country, from about a high of 35 years ago of about 4,500 stores throughout the country to a low of about 2,500, more or less.
Wow.
Over the last 10 years, however, another 1,000 stores have reopened.
That's great.
So we're at about 3,500. There's been a considerable rebound. Serious reading of the kind that you're nodding to was always a minority taste.
Right.
And these magazines, for all their vaunted circulation, which was high at the time, 80,000. Maybe in the instance of Ramparts, they got up to about 250,000 at
Right.
one point. They were never mass circulation.
No, not millions like a
news-
Playboy
no,
or a Time.
Forget about Time, Newsweek. These had millions of people who looked at their soundbite journalism of the time and their very hackneyed phrases. But the truth of the matter is that you didn't need a majority of citizens to actually affect the culture.
Yeah.
The culture was affected by the yeast of the petri dish, where really exciting things were happening. So we're now in a world which, among the other contradictory and interesting things that are happening, there's a slow food movement, right?
Yeah.
That pushes it back against the industrial agro complex. There is as you well know, there is a resurgence, not at scale but significant, in vinyl.
Right.
There is a resurgence in the bookstores.
Yeah.
There are people who are, we could call them digital dissenters, right? Who are like opting out and saying, no, the problem in this world, which is going much too fast, is we got to slow down, smell the roses, find the beauty, find the joy, and not become these gloomy, pessimistic people who think it's all over. No, the great thing about history is we don't know what's going to happen the day after tomorrow. And yes, it's true, as one of these sages observed, either Joyce or Marx, or both in the same way, but reverse sides of the same coin,
Yeah.
that history weighs on the brain of the living like a nightmare, right? And that's why it's given to the young to create history, because they are not paralyzed with fear, and they think the world is their oyster and everything's new, and then they get the right to screw it up in their own way. So,
Right.
so I am not a pessimist, despite the very considerable challenges that are in front of it. And I leaf through these pages, and I really take heart. There's a wide-eyed glee at trying to absorb the abundance of the world and to try to puzzle out its contradictions
Yeah.
that you see in the many writers who belly up to the table of the Evergreen Review. And you have done a masterful job at inviting us to join them at that table.
Well, thank you. I'm sitting here and I'm thinking, you're a guy who published Donald Cox's memoirs, Black Panther, an amazing coffee table book about People's Park, and especially centered around the 1960s People's Parks stuff. And you did the Warren Hinkle book. So you, Steve, have taken your roots at Berkeley as a teenager and your associations with Panthers and Yippies and entertainment figures, and you've kept this going in your own way with Heyday. It's been great.
That's generous for you. Then why is it we're looking at a $300,000 cash shortfall?
Right.
Could you repeat that phrase, digital?
Dissenters.
Yeah, digital dissenters. Yeah.
Yeah. Those of you that know me, Facebook, to me, Spotify is the devil, right? And I'll tell you why I think Spotify is the devil. I'm going to get a little off topic, but kind of on topic, because it also applies to books. So think about it. When I was a teenager, or even later when it was CD era, I woke up, I said, I don't have the Beatles' Abbey Road on CD. So I go to a record store and I buy that. And then I realize, oh, Cindy Williams, she's got a new album out. Oh, there's this Creedence Clearwater Revival. So I walk out with 3 CDs, 3 artists made money, 3 record companies made money, and the record store made some money. Now people wake up, they go, I haven't heard Abbey Road in a while. They go to Spotify. Nobody really made any money, right? So that's my argument against Spotify, right? People do not go to physical brick and mortar stores and linger and shop and buy a whole bunch of stuff at full price with full royalty rates, et cetera, et cetera. So now some of you will argue, and it's true, you'll hear something on Spotify and then you'll run to the store and buy it, and that's great. But I know, I'm kind of in the music world as Steve is in the publishing world, and I can tell you over the last 15 years, I've watched shit sell less and less and less and less, to the point that things that I would put out that would sell 5,000 copies, I consider it a winner if we do 1,200 copies.
So there are at least 2 questions that are braided together here that are often braided together.
Sure.
Which is one, a question of commerce, and one, a question of artistic creation.
Right.
And what I know is this.
Yeah.
Our species is defined. You need books the way I need music. I can't imagine a life without music.
Right.
And you probably can't imagine a life without books.
That's right.
So in addition to our opposable thumbs, that's how we know we're human beings, because we have this endless need to tell each other stories.
Yeah.
Because that is the way we extract meaning from otherwise inchoate lives that are untethered to anything that makes us think that there's some kind of meaning to the universe. So we have to we have to be the meaning we desire. We have to be the revolution we desire. We have to live the future we want to inhabit. And everything in our world tries to cut us off from each other and from ourselves. So we look to these books, we look to see what is the wisdom that might be contained in these yellowing pages that someone has, wherever they were, in whatever language, either through the medium of poetry or novels or an essay which tries to grapple with the world around them and make sense of it. What is, they have to try to answer, however modestly or immodestly, that question they were asking as an 11-year-old or a 9-year-old or a 16-year-old that doesn't quite go away, and which encounters with all these other people don't ever quite satisfy for you. So you are set on your path. And here's what I know. We now live in a world, for all the gloom of the ways in which stories are transmitted to people, sliced and diced and sold and commodified and all of that, we live in a world in which technology has democratized the means of production. It is possible for everybody in this room, and probably everybody in this room has probably tried to do this, to not only the way we used to do is like mimeograph a little and staple it together and
Fanzines.
and try to get high off the smell, or go to Romular and
Right.
and do these things. But you have the possibility to have an actual book-like object that very much resembles the books that were published by mainstream publishers. It looks dignified. The font looks good. You have this. Now your problem is, how do you cut through the noise of the culture and get attention for deserving work? So in these matters, I remain a Leninist. Better fewer, but better. If only 6 people had come here tonight, I would convince myself that these are the 6 right people. And if it's true to go back
That'd
to
be my
your
6 favorite people. That's for
6
damn
favorite
sure.
people, but let's use your political analogies. When Fidel Castro found himself alone after the disastrous landing in December of 1956 in the Sierra Maestra, his men bombed by Batista, who had discovered his whereabouts. Che Guevara, your hero here, wounded in the neck, and all he can think of as he's bleeding out. By the way, if you look at his memoirs, Reminiscence of a Cuban Revolutionary War, all he can think about is the story he read as a teenager by Jack London called Fire, about a guy dying in the Klondike and ice, and he's starting to freeze. That's the main thought. So Che Guevara is dying out on a beach or the jungle in Cuba, and what he remembers is what he read in school in Buenos Aires. He read the Jack London, and that's the thing that inflames his imagination. And, there was Castro, miraculously unscathed, and he looks at the 12 ragged people around him who've survived out of the 82 men who landed. It's 12 survived. And he looks at them, and they all say, they look at him, it's curtains, right?
Right.
And he looks at them and he says, from this day forth, Batista is doomed. The dictator is doomed. Think of the confidence, think of the conviction, think of the near theological faith in destiny. One of the things our culture lacks is a belief in ourselves, and we get a little bit bullied by the bully. And I would say that one of the things that this book delivers is a verdict which it may not be too strong to say in those ringing words that Fidel uttered in that trial after the disaster of the 26th of July, history will absolve me. Maybe, too, we can say with this book that the culture has very largely absolved the anarchic prophecies of Allen Ginsberg and the others that are contained in these beautiful pages.
Well, thank you. Steve, you probably haven't read it yet.
No, my opinions are untainted by any actual familiarity with the book.
No, but no, you're echoing the last thing I say in my introduction. As I was finishing this book off, writing the introduction, I watched, what's the movie about the making of Apocalypse Now? Hearts of Darkness? And I realized that Francis Ford Coppola, Barney, Rosset, and the crew were the same type of thing. Francis mortgaged his house and did all this crazy shit. And he was going to make that fucking movie if it was the last thing he did. And that's how Barney and Richard Seaver. And so I make this comparison between
So
Coppola.
it's interesting. All these people, by the way,
Yeah.
by your own account, and it's quite true, they didn't do it to make a buck.
No,
It wasn't money that sustained them or that mesmerized them.
no, that's right. And
It's interesting.
And I'm going to quote my recently deceased dad. He said, Pat, if making money was important to you, you would have figured that out years ago and said you're doing this crazy shit. So I want to open this up to the floor. Yeah.
So before we start, let me use that to run to the audience because we want people online.
Oh, yeah, right,
And then the two of you.
And thank
can
you so
share-
much for your what appeared to be rapt attention. So thank you so very much.
Hey, thanks so much. I want to bounce off the slogans comment a bit. So behind the slogans are new left revolutionaries who actually produced a lot of literature, right? That's reflected in your book. Can you talk a little bit about why, out of all the revolutionary movements, this particular one from the Panthers, from your amazing first book, and others produced so much good literature in between all the other things?
Well, you know, to me, many of the Panthers, Cleaver, Bobby, Huey, Yippies, Krasner, Jerry, Abby, these guys were all really fucking smart. You know, Huey had memorized the entire California Penal Code. When a cop would fuck with him, he could go, according to, page 17, paragraph 3. I mean, that was some scary shit. And so these were really, really well-read people, right? The Panthers had a reading list, right? In order to be a Panther, you had to read, some of the obvious things like Chairman Mao's Little Red Book, but there were a lot of other things. I'm kind of forgetting what your question was now. I feel like I'm answering it partially.
I think you got it.
Okay. The problem is, and now I'm going to sound like, old man grumpus. When I was a kid, and let's say I'm hanging out with you in my small town of Corning, New York, and you said, hey, have you ever heard of the Kinks, right? I might go to the library and dig up some old issues of Rolling Stone. I might go to like 30 buddies' houses, and maybe between them there's 4 Kinks. It could take me like 5 years to really figure out who the hell the Kinks were, from the early days to the late, right? Now, you go on the internet, you watch 10 YouTube videos, you read the Wikipedia, oh, I know everything there is to know about the Kinks. No, you don't. You just quickly, it's like going to McDonald's and saying, I just ate a steak or a piece of prime rib because you ordered a Big Mac. Learning is something that's done slowly and methodically, and you marinate in it, okay? And one of the things I think that's happened in our culture, with not all young people, because I've met some ones that amaze me, is that everybody thinks that if I read a Wikipedia page and I watch 10 YouTube videos, I know everything there is to know about Miles Davis. No, you're just fucking starting.
What's better for the Kinks than Miles Davis? From the artist's perspective, what is better?
Actually, could you say that?
And my question was, what's better for Miles Davis and the Kinks from the artist? Like, I would think that maybe the more rapid consumption is better for the artist.
Not necessarily, because again, back to my Spotify rent, nobody's bought anything. Right? Who made money if you watch 10 Kinks videos? Did Ray Davies get publishing on that? Maybe a penny? I don't know. I'm an analog guy. That's why I'm in this room. This is like fucking porn to me. This is like being 14 years old and finding dad's porn stash.
It was porn. I remember at being 14, being busted for dealing pot in my high school at Berkeley, and being sentenced, had my hair cut, and was sentenced to 6 months probation. I had to accompany my mother as she dragged my little sister to ballet dance. She was at the San Francisco Ballet with, down on where the Alexandria Theater is, and they're going to turn that into a condo. There was a bookstore across the street, and I discovered Bonnie Rosset had published Grove Edition, the 2,000-page compendium of Victoriana erotica called My Secret Life, which was by Anonymous, which was the endless story of a very privileged man who had all these sexual encounters with women he would suborn. And it was full of Victorian language describing sex acts. I had no idea what they were actually talking about, but I was very interested to find out. Anyway, it saved my adolescence. And I had occasion to tell Barney Rosset that Grove Press had actually saved my teenage years when I was privileged to confer upon him the Lifetime Achievement Award for the National Book Critics Circle Association back at this remove. I think it was the last century, sometime in the late 1990s. But let's take another question.
Way there in the back.
Since, as you both argue, the history seems to have vindicated the Evergreen Review, is there a backstory to its perfect title, Evergreen Review?
I don't have the answer to that. I can't remember. It's probably in the context of the book. But
I would hazard a guess. That is a great, and like all great questions, an obvious one that has eluded me. I've never asked it, and it should be asked. I suspect it has something to do with the conviction by the editors that these were not just pieces that to wrap fish in, as the expression would have it. These were literature's the news, famously, that stays news. So these reviews and articles, they were evergreen. And indeed, you can return to them today and derive a tremendous amount of pleasure and knowledge, and they still breathe. I think they do. They're not dead on the page.
yeah. I want to add to that. The idea behind the Evergreen Review, unlike most magazines, Evergreen Review would stay on a newsstand or in a place like this for up to a year, right? So it wasn't, oh my God, I missed the last issue. It was a quarterly. Also, since we're talking about images, imagine in August 1970 seeing Peter and Allen like this. I mean, this probably made some heads explode.
And that was taken by Richard Avedon.
That's right.
The next picture he took was of Paul Krasner with his girlfriend. They were naked, and Krasner had a heart on. That's in the Avedon photograph.
Yes.
And he's holding a smaller American flag.
Yeah. Go ahead.
I think you both have talked a lot about youth and how influential the idea of youth was to the Evergreen Review. I was wondering, as you were putting this together, did you stumble across something that you felt later in life maybe the person who wrote it would have had a different opinion on, or something that you knew they had changed their opinion on? Or is there anything that you read that you...
Oh, that's a really good
thought of?
question. Well, Julius Lester, who appears in there, who, like I said, was a black political activist, and I'm not an expert on Julius, but like Stanley Crouch, there were certain members of the African American community that were very radical in the 60s and 70s, and later sort of became right-wingers. And Crouch definitely did, but I think Julius Lester became more conservative and sort of disavowed some of his radical thoughts. Eldridge Cleaver is an example, although, and you knew Eldridge, I didn't. I always thought I always thought Eldridge was maybe a little bit of a show. What's your take on Eldridge being a Republican, supposedly, and a Christian?
That's a longer conversation.
Yes. We'll go to Vesuvio after this.
Let's suffice to say, I knew all three men, Julius Lester, Stanley Crouch, as well as Eldridge. Eldridge was a huckster and a wannabe gangster who was transactional to the max.
That was my
He,
guess.
he was also incredibly charming when he wanted to be, with very sexy eyes and a drawl and a relaxed voice which concealed a pretty hard guy within. And there are very disobliging things about Eldridge, which have often been covered up. The woman, for example, who made it possible for the Panthers to establish their international section in Algiers, Elaine Klein, who, as a young student in the early 50s in Paris, from a nice Jewish girl from Connecticut, who fell in with the Algerian freedom fighters who were then organizing to resist French colonialism. She later married one of them. If you ever watch the Battle of Algiers, there's a scene in which Mathieu, the general who is organizing the torture of the militants, is giving a press conference, and he's assembled. There's an international press section, and various press people are peppering him with questions, and they ask him, but you were in Indochina at Dien Bien Phu, and if we're not mistaken, your resume includes being in the resistance against the Nazis during occupation. How is it that you are now here orchestrating a torture campaign against these people who are fighting for their liberation? And he looks at them and draws on his cigarette, and he looks at them and he says, "It is not for a soldier to determine the cause in which he is ordered to fight. If you have a problem with the policy, go to the politicians. Go to the politicians," he says. And another woman asks a question, and the woman who asked that question is Elaine Klein, who was herself married to one of the leaders of the FLNN, the liberation.
Yeah.
So she is in that. She recently wrote a memoir published by Verso, if I'm not mistaken,
wow.
about 5 years ago, if I count, in which she accuses or alleges Eldridge of having murdered at least one Panther who he had suspected of having an affair with his wife, Kathleen.
That would not surprise me.
And everybody who knows these circumstances are not altogether surprised by such an allegation. So I have complicated feelings about Eldridge. With respect to Julius Lester wrote a terrific book called Listen, Whitey, Black Power's Gonna Get Your Mama. I think also published by Grove Press, had a very
Yes.
dramatic cover, yellow and white, a great looking cover. And Julius Lester, who was a genius writer and could everything he touched, from children's stories to works of history, he wrote fluently and with intelligence. And he made the migration and converted to Judaism. Rather improbably, and remained to the end of his life a lively guy. And I would not say that he became a conservative so much, really.
Right.
Stanley Crouch was just a grouch.
He was. Crouch was a grouch.
Crouch was a grouch. I knew him very well, and brilliant. Wrote about music.
Nobody
Charlie
loved jazz
Parker.
more, and
No.
nobody hated Miles Davis' electric period more than Stanley.
Right. So Stanley was quirky, contrarian, liked to be deliberately provocative to people, but you couldn't really predict on what side of an issue he would land. I learned something from all those guys without necessarily swallowing each and every one of their pitchers of Kool-Aid.
Anyway, that was a long answer. to your-
Sorry about that.
Thank
We
you.
got some online questions coming through.
Okay.
Oh, Tom says, is there any mention of Roy Kuhlman art covers in your book? And were you aware of a new book coming out by his daughter?
I was not aware of the book. If he designed the covers of Evergreen, all 100 covers are in there. At one point, I wanted to write an extensive article or have some write about the various illustrators. As you can see from the size of this book, at some point I had to stop. I focused instead. I wanted to capture what it felt like to be in the office with Barney. And so Claudia Menza and Nat Sobel and some other people I interviewed, that was the most important thing for me. What was it? What did the air feel like? You know, one of the things, you know, if you study history like academically, people want to argue, you know, was it a Tuesday or a Wednesday? Was it raining or was it sunshine? You know, who really cares? What I like to do when I interview people is what did it feel like to be there? You know, what I did with Listen Whitey and what I did with the Jerry Rubin book and what I try to do with this book is to capture the feeling of what it was like to be in the office. Not was it definitely May 68 on the 22nd or was it definitely the 23rd that happened? It doesn't really matter 50 years later.
I just want to honor the question about Kuhlman, I think his name is. In addition to a whole generational cohort of people who were influenced by Bauhaus design, by the resurgence or the rediscovery of the Russian constructivists, he was not alone in the marvelous aesthetic approach he took to book design and typography. And Stephen Heller, who's a younger generation who came to be an art director at the New York Times, but started out doing radical, alternative, countercultural newspapers. Stephen Heller, who's about my age, wrote a few years ago a marvelous memoir called Growing Up Underground, a memoir of counterculture New York, in which he pays homage to all these people who are not known to the general public, only to the cognoscenti. You have to be a truly obsessed person to know the...
I know that book very well because I'm a nut.
There, because you're a nut. And I, for reasons best known to myself, seem to keep hoovering up these books as well. And I'm always learning some interesting tidbit. And one of the things you really learn is the curious way that ideas fall through time and circumstance, and that it isn't just box office, it's not just the circulation, or even primarily the circulation or the number of listeners, that is the real metric of how an idea or an act influences culture. Books, paintings, magazines, even gossip can have an effect out of all proportion to the actual number of people who experience it. They have strange lives as they fall through time and circumstance and twist and tumble in relation to other magazines and books and music and encounter people. And so you really do not know that the right listener may lie waiting to be born. I mean, you're born in 1964.
Yeah.
I mean, this magazine basically comes to its
Peaks 4 or 5 years later.
4 or 5 years later. So this act of devoted archaeology, literary archaeology that you're doing in American culture is because you were born. You were the Messiah they were waiting to appear, and you did.
Oh my God, that's amazing. Okay.
So we're
How can we?
coming up to the top of the hour, and I think that may be it, but any last thoughts?
Well, now that I've been declared a countercultural messiah, I'm going to go to Vesuvio after this and hold court there if you want to talk to the messiah. I hope some of you will join me. Let me just grab that book there. So really, you know, the one last sales pitch. But as I mentioned about this book, or maybe Steve can do this while I talk, the facsimile pages are really what makes this book special. Is, again, it's as if you're having those issues in your hands, right? And so you're getting all of these. See what we did here? The previous Evergreen Review anthologies, and they were amazing, did not have this. They were typeset.
This is beautiful.
Yeah. And this was painstakingly done. The other thing is, for any art directors or graphic people, their editors, it took us months to realize if we missed a page, or sometimes pages were in there twice, right? So there were several times that we'd be screaming in pain when someone goes, well, you realize, because when it's page and page of text, it's easy to get lost, right, as you're laying it out. First, you know, and so this book was several years in the making. You know, that's awesome. Yeah, look at that. And like I said, I reproduced some of the ads and some of the other goodies in there. Yeah, I don't know what else to say except, as I mentioned earlier, you're not going to find a less expensive, larger, more informative book in this store, even though this store is packed with great books. I want to thank Steve. Oh, you have one last question there, Tiger?
Yes. What is your opinion of ramparts, especially given the fact that they were like right there along with Evergreen Review, and they had a similar, the editors, or at least one of them, had a similar shift, serious seismic shift from far left to far right. And
We're not going to discuss David Horowitz here, man. That's not going to happen. The only thing I'll say, there's a small but very informative history of ramparts by our mutual friend Peter Richardson. And I will also say that I have had many phone calls with someone who has a complete collection of ramparts about doing a similar ramparts book.
You very much should. And it should be done while Bob Scheer is still alive.
Yeah.
One of the principal editors.
Yeah.
I will say about David Horowitz. David Horowitz basically mounted a coup against the other Ramparts editors and basically had a chance to preside over Ramparts in its senescence. Its best days were behind them, and once he'd run it into the ground, then he decided to take the Koch brothers' money and go off to the dark side, where he's probably having the last laugh.
Yeah, I think that's kind of about it. I want to thank Peter here at City Lights for bringing me back again. Some of you, Shelley she drove all the way from Davis. If anyone, well, you came from Santa Cruz. Do we have Tijuana? Do I hear Portland, Oregon? Thank you. Thanks again, Steve. And thanks, everybody. Cheers.